EDTP 3301 Programs and Services for Special Populations. Historical timeline created by Sarah Johnson. This timeline will feature court cases and legislation that have impacted bilingual education over time. The first case was presented in 1923, Meyer v. Nebraska. Robert Meyer went against the state of Nebraska after they passed the 1919 Simmons Act. This act prohibited any school, whether it be public or private, from teaching foreign languages to grades 8 and below. He went to the Supreme Court after he was fined for teaching Bible stories to children in German. The Supreme Court ruled this as unconstitutional due to it going against the 14th Amendment. The Supreme Court ruled that while the state can legislate the language in schools, they cannot prohibit the community from giving private language lessons outside of the school. The second case was in 1927, Farrington v. Tokui. The Territory of Hawaii passed a law that made it illegal to teach foreign languages without a permit in schools. Families went against this law as it restricted children from learning the values that their parents wanted them to learn. The Supreme Court ruled this unconstitutional as it went against the Fifth Amendment. This case mainly focused on the rights for parents to teach the children the languages and values that they want outside of school. The third case we look at today is in 1954, Brown versus the Board of Education. This is the most known case in education as it is the one that introduced desegregation in the classroom. The schools in the United States were segregated and students were to go to their separate schools even if they were across town. The Browns filed a lawsuit saying that the segregation was unconstitutional. The court ruled that the term separate but equal went against the 14th Amendment, with it being for equal protection for all. This allowed for desegregation in schools all around the country. While it was mainly focused for African Americans, people of other cultures were segregated as well. The case showed that ELL students can't be fully separated from other students throughout their education under the guise of helping them to learn English. The first piece of legislation we're looking at today was in 1965, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. It was passed on April 11, 1965. The act was created to provide resources to low-income students. It provided funds, policies, and procedures for these low-income families. It was created as a part of President Lyndon B. Johnson's War on Poverty movement. The act provided states with the funds to start bilingual education programs if they chose to start them, provide preparation programs for bilingual teachers, and help with the development of bilingual programs. The next piece of legislation we look at is the Bilingual Education Act, which was passed January 2, 1968. It was introduced by Texas Senator Ralph Yarborough, who introduced the bill for funding for bilingual programs. The Bilingual Education Act entered into federal law as Title VII, as it provided grants to school districts and other eligible entities through a competitive grant process. This act called for inclusivity for all students who knew limited English. The act has been reauthorized 6 times, and each time there is more focus on the benefits of bilingual education and helping English language learners achieve fluency throughout their learning. The next case we're going to look at is in 1974, Lau versus Nicholls. Chinese American students in San Francisco were placed in general education classrooms despite not being fluent in English. The students were left to struggle with the idea of to sink or to swim. Kenny Kinman Lau and other students challenged the school district and filed a lawsuit against Alan Nicholls, the president of the district at the time. The district court decided that the students weren't being discriminated against and that they were receiving equal treatment with the rest of the students. However, when the case was brought to the Supreme Court, after looking onto Section 604 of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the court ruled in favor of Lau. Justice William Douglas argued in favor of Lau, saying, "There is no equality of treatment merely by providing students with the same facilities, textbooks, teachers, and curriculum. For students who do not understand English are effectively foreclosed from any meaningful form of education." The case led to the creation of the law release. The law remedies required school districts to create bilingual education programs for English language learners. The next piece of legislation we look at is also in 1974, the Equal Education Opportunities Act. It was passed in August 21, 1974. The act was created from the decision of Lau v. Nicholls. The act states, "No state shall deny educational opportunities to an individual on account of his or her race, color, sex, or national origin. The failure of an educational agency to take appropriate action to overcome language barriers that impede equal participation by its students in its instructional programs." The Act protects bilingual students' rights to have equal opportunity to learn in the classroom. The next case we're going to look at was in 1981, and it's Castaneda versus Picard. In Raymondville, Texas, Roy Castaneda felt that his children were being discriminated against due to their ethnicity. In 1978, the district court ruled in favor of the school district. The Castanedas took the case to the U.S. Court of Appeals, and they ruled in favor of the Castanedas. This case created a set of mandates that determined how the bilingual programs would be assessed for requirements. The Castaneda standards are as follows. The program has to be based on sound educational theory. It must be implemented with effective resources and personnel, and the program must prove that it's effective in helping students overcome language barriers. The Castaneda standards have become a set way to determine if an ELL program is adequate or not. However, the program has some faults. The first two standards can justify any program, and under the third standard, a certain amount of time has to pass to determine if a program is adequate or not. Despite these shortcomings, the Castaneda standards have successfully rectified inadequate ELL programs throughout the time of its use. The next piece of legislation we're going to look at was passed in December of 2001, and it was signed into law on January 8th of 2002 by President George W. Bush. This is the No Child Left Behind Act. The NCLB Act stresses accountability for all learners by setting targets for students to achieve proficiency levels on state achievement tests. The Act replaced the word bilingual with a limited English proficient label when depicting students from a deficit view. The Act does not have a set of national standards, as each state is required to develop its own set of standards for schools to follow. For example, in Texas, educators follow the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills Standards. The NCLB includes Title I provisions that are applied to disadvantaged students. The Act supports standards-based education on the idea that setting high standards and measurable goals can improve individual outcomes within education. In order to obtain funding, states have to give the state assessment test to all students within select grade levels. The last piece of legislation we're going to look at today was passed in July of 2009. This is the Race to the Top program. The program was created as part of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act by President Barack Obama. The RTTT has provided over $4 billion in grants for states to begin reform efforts in the educational system. This has 4 general requirements for RTTT funds. The first requirement is adopting internationally benchmarked standards that prepare students for success in college and the workplace, and high-quality assessments that are valid and reliable for all students, including English language learners and students with disabilities. The second requirement is recruiting, developing, rewarding, and retaining effective teachers and principals in the schools. The third requirement is increased transparency by building data systems that measure student success and inform teachers and principals how they can improve their practices. And the fourth requirement is supporting effective intervention strategies to turn around the lowest performing schools. Although this sounds good, ELL advocates and others have expressed deep concerns that the emphasis on high-stakes testing remains. The requirement that teacher performance evaluations are tied to the students' test scores mean that the teachers of English language learners will be held accountable for the test scores, and may be unfairly penalized for questionable validity. Civil rights groups also have found English language learner issues were not adequately addressed in funded state proposals.